In September 1939, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany invaded Poland, setting off World War II. German physicists, directed by Werner Heisenberg and others, hoped to use recent discoveries involving nuclear energy to design and build an atomic bomb. Scientists in the United States and other Allied countries responded in kind, hoping to beat Hitler to the creation and use of such a weapon. These scientists, many of them refugees from fascist regimes, took steps in 1939 to organize a project to exploit the newly recognized fission process for military purposes. Fission involves splitting the nucleus of an atom into more nuclei of lighter atoms, thereby releasing energy. The first scientist to contact the American government was George Pegram of Columbia University. Pegram arranged a conference between Enrico Fermi and the Navy Department in March 1939. In the summer of 1939, some scientists convinced Albert Einstein to use his influence to present the military potential of a nuclear reaction to President Franklin Roosevelt. In February 1940, $6,000 became available for research. Lyman Briggs, director of the National Bureau of Standards, started supervising the research committee. On December 6, 1941, Vannevar Bush took over as director of the project in the Office of Scientific Research and Development. After Imperial Japan's attack on the U.S. at Pearl Harbor the very next day, the United States entered World War II. Japan also researched atomic bombs, but never pursued its program strongly enough to develop the material and means to drop a bomb on Allied forces. By mid-1942, the American government realized that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would have to build many pilot plants, laboratories, and manufacturing facilities so that nuclear scientists could design and develop a usable atomic bomb. Because of this complexity, the War Department took over the project. In June 1942, the Corps of Engineers Manhattan District initially took over management of the construction work. Named that way because much early research was performed at Columbia University on Manhattan Island in New York City. In September 1942, Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves took command of the engineering activities of the project. Manhattan Project became the code name for research work that would extend across the country. In the fall of 1941, Americans Harold Urey and George Pegram visited England to set up a cooperative effort with Great Britain. In 1943, a combined policy committee with Great Britain and Canada was formed. That same year, scientists from Britain and other European countries moved to the U.S. to join the project. For the project to achieve quick success, several lines of research and development had to operate simultaneously. The United States then had to produce the needed explosive materials and adapt them for use in an actual bomb. Uranium-235 was the essential fissionable component of the proposed bomb. However, initially scientists did not have a process for separating it from another isotope, the much more abundant uranium-238. They had to determine how to separate the respective isotopes by physical means, and explored several methods to do so. Eventually, they chose two processes: the electromagnetic process, developed at the University of California, Berkeley, under Ernest Lawrence, and the diffusion process, developed under Harold Urey at Columbia. Both processes, especially the diffusion method, required large, complex facilities and huge amounts of electric power to produce even small amounts of separated uranium-235. Philip Abelson developed a third method called thermal diffusion, which scientists used for a time to create preliminary separation. These methods went into production at a 70-square-mile tract near Knoxville, Tennessee, originally known as the Clinton Engineer Works and later as Oak Ridge. Only one method existed for the production of fissionable plutonium-239. Arthur Compton, in the metallurgical lab of the University of Chicago, supervised the transmutation of uranium to plutonium in a reactor pile. In December 1942 in Chicago, Enrico Fermi and Associates finally produced a controlled fission chain reaction in this reactor. Producing 239 required constructing a huge, powerful reactor to generate about 25,000 kilowatt-hours of heat for each resulting gram of plutonium. Such production involved developing chemical extraction procedures to work under conditions never used before. A transitional step in putting this method into production involved the construction of a medium-sized reactor at Oak Ridge. New large-scale production reactors were built on an isolated 1,000-square-mile tract on the Columbia River near Pasco, Washington, the Hanford Engineer Works. Before 1943, work on the design and function of the bomb itself was largely theoretical, based on basic experiments done at various locations. In that year, J. Robert Oppenheimer created and began directing a laboratory on an isolated mesa at Los Alamos, New Mexico, 34 miles northwest of Santa Fe. This laboratory developed methods of reducing fissionable products from production plants to pure metal and then fabricating the metal to required shapes. Scientists learned how to bring together rapidly separate amounts of fissionable material to create a critical mass and thereby a nuclear explosion. In the uranium bomb, scientists used a gun design to fling together two subcritical masses to create an explosive critical mass. In the plutonium bomb, the scientists used implosion to precisely compress subcritical parts to achieve the same result. Scientists also had to build a light enough weapon that the Army Air Force could drop from a plane and which would detonate at a desired altitude above the target. Scientists had to solve most of these problems before the production plants made great amounts of fissionable material. Otherwise, the bombers would not have enough material in the shortest time desired. By 1944, the Allies knew that Nazi Germany had done only basic nuclear research and was far from developing an atomic bomb. Nevertheless, the Manhattan Project continued. By the summer of 1945, the Hanford Works had produced enough plutonium-239 to provide for a nuclear bomb. Also, weapon development and design had progressed enough so Los Alamos could schedule a field test of a nuclear explosive. Working with engineers and explosives experts, scientists had to assemble complicated equipment so they could measure the weapon's success or failure. By this time, the original $6,000 seed money for the Manhattan Project had grown to a staggering $2 billion. The first atomic bomb, using plutonium, exploded at 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, at an isolated area of the Alamogordo Air Base, 120 miles south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It detonated on top of a steel tower surrounded by scientific equipment, with remote monitoring taking place in bunkers occupied by scientists and dignitaries 10,000 yards away. The explosion came as an intense light flash, a sudden wave of heat, and then a huge roar as the shock wave spread out and echoed away. A fireball rose rapidly, followed by a mushroom cloud extending to 40,000 feet. Scientists estimated that the bomb had produced an explosion equal to 15,000 to 20,000 tons of TNT. The tower completely vaporized and the surrounding desert surface fused to glass for a radius of 800 yards. To keep the bomb secret from civilians who chanced to see the distant blast, the project created a cover story claiming that the event had resulted from an accident involving a huge pile of ordinary munitions. When scientists worked to finish the bomb, U.S. government officials had the unwelcome task of selecting which cities on which to use the weapon. A so-called target committee, composed chiefly of scientists and military personnel, selected cities according to a few criteria. The target must have many closely built frame buildings and other construction vulnerable to damage by blast and fire. The target must contain a densely built-up area of at least 1 mile in radius. The target must have a high military value. The target should be untouched by previous raids to help determine the bomb's actual power. The target's destruction should be so convincing as to persuade Japan to surrender quickly. The target committee eventually selected the following cities for potential destruction: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Yokohama. On August 6, 1945, a specially equipped B-29 bomber dropped the uranium bomb on Hiroshima. According to the Manhattan Project's best estimates, total persons killed in Hiroshima was about 66,000 and total wounded about 69,000. 3 days later, after first visiting Kokura, which was clouded over, another B-29 dropped the plutonium bomb on Nagasaki, the backup target. Total persons killed was about 39,000 and total wounded about 25,000. In both cities, people continued to die by the thousands for days, weeks, and even months later, due mainly to internal injuries and/or radiation poisoning. Even after the second bombing, some military extremists in Japan wanted to continue the war. But the young Emperor Hirohito realized that future resistance could bring only distress and devastation to his people. On August 15th, the Emperor himself announced Japan's surrender over the radio. For at least 2 reasons, the speech stunned the Japanese people. First, because it occasioned the first time that the vast majority of the nation heard their ruler's voice. And second, because up to that point, the nation was still on a very strong war footing. On September 2nd, on board the battleship USS Missouri, Japanese officials formally signed the instruments of surrender. As with any monumental decision in history, scholars continue to debate the wisdom of dropping the bombs. Main arguments against using the bomb included the Allies could have displayed to Japan the bomb's devastation in an unpopulated area, and that conventional bombing eventually could have led to Japan's surrender. Main arguments for using the bomb included that Japan received multiple warnings that the Allies had a devastating new weapon, and that using the bomb saved countless Allied and Japanese lives to be lost in a land invasion, thus shortening the war by months. Whichever the case may be, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, World War II finally was over.